But this evening's program is brought to you by RAD, which is the Regional Asset District, as well as Highmark Allegheny Health Network as our major sponsors. The program, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, African Americans at the Ballot, will help us talk about that particular issue, voting rights, and so forth for African Americans. This event, which is our second year recognizing what we call Civic Season, it's actually an initiative of about 130 to 140 museums from across the country. The initiative is actually called Made by Us. And it is something that we're all gonna do across the country at various museums and cultural institutions, including the Smithsonian Institution, to do programming and to do the type of museum work that we normally do, leading up to 2026, where this nation will celebrate and recognize its 250th anniversary. So we're getting sort of a jump start on those things. And the other part of that is that, you know, at the History Center, every year we take part in the citizenship ceremony, in which the ceremony is held here for the Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania region as people become naturalized citizens of the United States. And if you understand and know that process, there's a bit of information you need to know about the United States and its history and its laws and customs and so forth. And so the question came up of how many of us who were actually born in the United States, born citizens and not immigrants who had to be naturalized, really know and understand the history of this country and so forth. So this program is a part of that. So it's a part of talking about the struggle of African Americans and the 15th Amendment, basically, which is that constitutional amendment that provides voting rights, not only to African American men at that time in 1870, but also further on 50 years later for American women. And we continue to struggle in this country with voting rights. I'm not going to get into it because we have three wonderful panelists here who's going to talk a lot more about the subject and carry the program on. But what I would want to do right now is introduce a moderator for this evening's event, who is the wonderful Miracle Jones. And Miracle comes to us tonight from One Hood Media. She'll mention a few more things about herself, but she's going to moderate this activity. Not only does she work for One Hood Media, but she is also an activist. She is one of those people who is constantly making sure that the rights, not only of African Americans, but of all people are protected and respected in this country. So if I can introduce Miracle Jones.
I'm going to sit down. Thank you all so much for joining us for Freedom is a Constant Struggle. We are doing a hybrid section, so people are, of course, here at the History Center, but also people are on Zoom. And so if you see us looking at our phones, please don't think we're being disrespectful. We're working with tech and trying to make sure people's questions are getting answered and we're staying on time. How this program is going to go is Ray is going to do a small presentation. Annie and I will have a conversation. Ray will come back for another presentation, and then we'll open up the question and answers. If you could, please write your questions down as they happen, because we may actually answer them as we go on. If there is a question you really think that we haven't asked, or a question you really want us to make sure we get to, we'll do about 30 minutes at the end for questions and answers. We'll ask people to have very brief conversations. In the interim, please make sure your cell phones are silence. And I'm going to read Ray's bio now as we get ready for our first presentation. So our first presenter is Ray Block. And what's really, really cool, in addition to being the associate professor in the political science and African American Studies Department, Ray Block Jr. is the Lawrence and Lynn Brown McCourtney Endowed Career Professor in Penn State University's McCourtney Institute for Democracy. He is also a senior analyst for the African American Research Collaborative, a group of community engaged pollsters, scholars, researchers, and commentators committed to bringing an accurate understanding of African American civic engagement to the public discourse. Block's research interests include racial, ethnic, and gender differences in civic involvement, the formation and mutability of social identity, campaigns and elections, and other topics. His recent works explores how COVID-19 pandemic both reflects and contributes to ongoing social inequality in the United States, and to talk a little bit about the history of voting rights with a little bit of a focus and flair on Pennsylvania. Please welcome Professor Ray Block.
Erica, you make me sound way better. You make me sound so good. So I want to stand. It's on.
Can't hear you very well.
This is not showing. Hold on.
We can switch out.
Okay, this is better. So I'm going to stand. I'm usually like to pay some jittery person by nature, so don't mind me. I figure that one thing that I can do is, as a person who has the opportunity to be in front of a crowd and to talk about some of these things, I'm a professor by training, but I'm a civically involved citizen of the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania by everything else. And as a concerned citizen, I come to you to talk about some of the things that I just so happen to know some stuff about, but more importantly, I care a whole lot about. So voting and voting rights is what this is about. I figured this is going to be a really brief and not very historical take on this because I'm not a historian, but we're going to talk about where we came from and where we're going. So to start with this, a little more added stuff to the intro. Basically, everything that I do involves me looking at social identity and political involvement. Social identity can be ethnicity and race and gender and sexuality. It could also be political ideology and party identification too. Or it could be geographic region. As a person who's lived all over the world, I know that people feel a very strong affinity to their part of the country. So it could be those things, those identities that we just care a lot about. Political involvement can be behavioral in the sense that you can protest if you think things aren't right, or you could vote and actually cast a ballot for the candidate you think is the one that you would like to serve you in office. Political involvement can also be attitudinal. You could express an interest in politics, for example, or you could feel like the system is working on your behalf and you trust it. My dissertation was actually on political interest. In other words, I wanted to know why some people were fascinated with politics and other people weren't. Interestingly enough, because I'm kind of getting up there in age, I got my PhD in 2006. What I noticed in 2008 is that certain patterns in how interested people were started to shift. In 2008, interest in politics skyrocketed among African Americans. I wonder if y'all can guess why that might be, right? So I didn't study presidents when I got my training in graduate school, but I became a presidency scholar because Obama came on the scene, and we hadn't had the opportunity to look at race at the presidency level that way before. So as a person who studies the first families now, I do work a lot of times with my spouse, and we look at, for example, the Obama administration, and that includes both Michelle Obama and Barack Obama as really important political figures. In addition to that, I believe that if you think about voting, for example, voting is a bridge that citizens use to connect what they care about to their leaders. If it works the right way, leaders do the things that voters want them to do. That whole process is what's known as political representation, and I look at how that bridge plays out in a bunch of ways. When I'm not doing research that's based in that stuff, I look at how all of the stuff that I just told you about, politics, political involvement, civic representation, etc., how that plays out in the area of police violence. Now, like most people, this happened, right? So COVID took my whole life over, and it also took my research agenda over. So all of the stuff that I just told you about ended up becoming used for us to study COVID-19 and what I call the politics of the pandemic. And I treat the study of COVID-19 as the study of social identity and the study of political equality. Because a lot of that stuff goes into what we understand about that too. No, I'm not a medical researcher, but I can talk to medical researchers because what they don't know about social identity and about politics, I can contribute to their understanding about epidemiology and about vaccine hesitancy and stuff like that. Today, I'll be talking about how this stuff plays out in the context of voting. It says presidential elections, and I want to talk to you on that. Sorry, not sorry, right? So how do we get here? I like the idea of starting with the Constitution of our Commonwealth. And it might not seem like it on a day-to-day basis, but we have a Constitution to be proud of in the sense that it's one of the least voting restrictive constitutions in the country. And I strongly believe that's a legacy worth protecting. Now, why is this important? Everybody should be able to elect the politicians that they believe are going to serve them best in politics. I care about this from a social identity perspective. And what that means is I don't believe there should be barriers to people, regardless of your background, getting the politician you want into office to serve your needs. In that sense, I believe it's really important to think about how racial history influences this legacy that we have in the state. And I really do want the Commonwealth to live up to its legacy. So it's important for all these reasons, and also because I think if we look at some of the history of voting patterns across this country, you'll get a good sense of some of the things that I think are issues and some of the things that I think are important to discuss. For example, I'm looking at presidential voting here, but I want you to at least just appreciate that there is this very good tendency among people who are African American to support Democratic candidates and issues consistently. And you should also notice that that's very different from what you see historically speaking if you look at voting patterns for white Americans, where at least if you're looking at white Americans, white voters are inclined to support both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which means both parties are fighting pretty equally for those votes. The vote shares are very divided when it comes to African American voters and very consistently supporting for the Democratic Party. Some people will say that that means that Black people love the Democrats. I don't believe that. What I believe is that African Americans are voting for the party that has a historical record and current sense of working on behalf of the issues that African Americans care about. And I think that because of that, if the parties were to switch, because they have before, it would be because the issues that that group cares about would be getting represented by people inside of that other party. So these are always conversations that show up because people wonder what might happen for Black voters to move. What would have to happen for Black voters to move is to have a very genuine sense that the Republican Party cares enough for the issues that Black people care about. And that's an open question. Now, the reason why this is important is because those differences give you a hint at some of the battles that have taken place over the years when it comes to securing voting rights. And this is a history that I think is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Some people might say 1 step forward and 5 steps back. Right? But the idea is that there's a very long history of battles being fought for the inclusiveness of voting rights and the inclusiveness of voting practices and voting access and all things related to voting. So the battle continues obviously. But I would be remiss if I didn't think about some of the milestones along the way. One of them is the 15th Amendment that was mentioned. There's also the Voting Rights Act of 1964. There's also, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then in 1982, the changes to it to make it even more inclusive, and significant Supreme Court cases like Thornburg and Jingles. I think that the Jingles case is really important because it allows us, for example, people like me, to think about how the use of information can be applied to legal battles that are being waged about whether or not the things that districts are doing and that municipalities are doing when it comes to their voting and how they handle their voting and how they manage it, how those things can be racially inclusive. And so one of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act is Section 5. In Section 5, what it does is, at the time, it was created so that jurisdictions that had a bad record of being exclusive and the types of patterns that they would run when they try to organize how voting works in those areas, it required these offending places to clear their plans for changing their voting rules with the federal government. In other words, places in the Deep South, for example, they couldn't change their voting laws without getting permission from the federal government to do so. That was changed not very long ago because it was considered to be unfair. And the logic was that these southern states and some northern municipalities, by the way, didn't need to get clearance from the federal government because those states and these municipalities knew how to run their own elections and make the changes they needed. And if you picked on some places, you either had to pick on everyone or you didn't pick on anyone, right? The cynic in me will point out that once the provision left from the Voting Rights Act, those same states that were being told to pre-clear went back to doing the same shenanigans they were doing before the Voting Rights Act had the power to monitor that kind of stuff. That gets us to another part. Where we're going in this case, I'm pretty worried. In other words, I believe that if the idea is for citizens to be able to choose who leads them in a manner that's equitable and transparent and generally fair, I am worried that we're not moving in a direction that supports that particular thing. For example, there's been a huge population shift in the Commonwealth where we have more minority residents in the Commonwealth and fewer white residents in the Commonwealth. That shift should accompany a change in how the districts look for congressional elections. In other words, the demographic changes should somehow be reflected in how the districts are being drawn up. And as a person who studies redistricting, this is one of those topics that really fascinates me. Now, what that also means is that we should pay attention to what happens around the process of redistricting, because the politically motivated drawing of district lines is a concern in the state. There's a current battle going on right now about how to finalize the redistricting process that's going on in the Commonwealth right now. This is a process that I've been very vocal about, and I've actually written a few things about. In addition to redistricting issues and gerrymandering, it's the fact that polarization is on the rise. I feel like this is not a controversial thing to say in this crowd, but the things that divide us are really being played up to the extent to where a lot of us don't believe we can break bread with the people from the opposing party, for example, or we're having a hard time seeing common ground across citizens because the divisions are so great. All of these things stand in the way of this process, and I hope it will be more equal and more fair. In addition to that, the gunning of the Voting Rights Act is credited to the Shelby v. Holder decision, because that's the decision that puts a lot of this stuff into motion, that creates an environment where it's politically expedient to deny large parts of the population the access to voting and the ability to vote in transparent and easy ways. Following along with that, it's this idea that we have a political environment where the sanctity of voting is politicized. And there are arguments about voter integrity, and there are arguments about voter fraud and the prevalence of it, and the extent to which it exists and alters the outcomes of elections. Some of these arguments don't even rest within the facts, but it doesn't matter to some people because those arguments are strong enough to polarize people further. Another thing that I'm worried about is that most people, if you take a civics class, a lot of people are cynical about Congress. They make a lot of jokes about it. There are a lot of people who have very colorful viewpoints about presidents. What I've noticed in my small time of being alive on this earth is that the perceived legitimacy of the Supreme Court is declining rapidly. In other words, there was once a time when people assumed members of the Supreme Court were above politics in some kind of way. And that perception is nowhere near as prevalent as it used to be. And if that's the case, if all branches of the federal government are being viewed with a general sort of suspicion by most citizens, as a person who listens to scholars from global politics, they tell me all the time that the lack of a perceived legitimacy in the government at the federal level is a warning sign for authoritarianism. And it's one of those steps that the country might take in order to move in that direction. So I have a lot of things that I'm concerned about. And I'm couching those concerns in this idea, generally speaking, but I really do believe that America should walk its walk when it comes to equality and freedom and justice and those things. And particularly the state of Pennsylvania, because I believe it's important that we live up to the legacy of the Commonwealth Constitution. I'll stop there.
My name is Annie Pearl Avery. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. And I came to Pittsburgh when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I stayed with an aunt by the name of Hale County. Her husband had died and they had this house. And she didn't want to stay in the house alone. They didn't have any children. And we came up on the Greyhound bus. And when we got to Cincinnati, we had to change buses. And she said, when we got on the bus that we changed to in Cincinnati, she said, and we were the only people on the bus, the first ones to get on the bus, to be low. And she said, you can sit anywhere you want. But you know, I'm 7 or 8 years old, I don't really understand that. What I did is, I went to the back of the bus and sit in the back seat. Why did I do that? Because this was a custom. And then later on, I got kind of used to not saying yes, sir, and yes, ma'am to white people just because they were white. I was saying yes, yes, no, sir to people just because they were white. And then I was able to ride in front of the bus. And also I was able to go to the movies, which I like the movies now. And I think Emmett Till was murdered while I was here. But I'm still a child now. I don't understand all this. I know something is going wrong, but I don't know exactly what. And I'm curious. And I kind of tried to find a newspaper to read, and I ended up sacrificing a nickel to buy a newspaper at the time. I was the only child member in the family here. There were others here, but I was the only child. So they were really spoiling me. You know, so I had a nickel to spare. But anyway, later on, I get lonesome for my mother and my other siblings, and I'm back in Birmingham. Now, I'm back in Birmingham at the back of the bus. Okay? I can't go see the movies when they premiere because they premiere at the white theaters first. Had to wait. Well, later on, there was a man killed by the name of Max Park. And I tried to follow the history of that until he was killed. They took him out of jail. They kept saying that they were going to take him out of jail. He had supposedly made some comment to a white female. And they finally took him out of jail and murdered this man. But anyway, Reverend Shuttlesworth there in Birmingham was trying to integrate the school with his children. And then in 1960, I heard about the Freedom Rides and the sit-ins. I said, if they come to Birmingham, I'm going with them. So finally, when they said they were coming to Birmingham, and as a matter of fact, I know Diane Nash personally. We spent some time in jail together. She was one of the first Freedom Rides. But anyway, when they said they were coming to Birmingham, I went and bought me a ticket so I could go with them. On my own, I went and bought this ticket. I couldn't afford to buy the ticket. I really shouldn't have bought the ticket. You know, because I was really poor then. There's a difference between being poor and poor. Poor is eating leftover grits. That's poor. That's poor. Not poor. I'm poor now. But anyway, when the bus got to Allentown, Alabama, it was bombed and people were beaten there. And one of my neighbors at the time, we were keeping up with this thing on the news, trying to. And when they got to Birmingham, she said to me, wait until this evening so my husband can watch the baby while I'm gone. And we walked 20 blocks to the Greyhound bus station. We went from 1st Street North to 20th Street North, was where the Greyhound bus station was. They just moved a couple of years ago from that location. But anyway, with the walking, we walked 20 blocks, and it didn't take long, 15, 20 minutes, we'd be there. And on the way, she said, one of my relatives is a part of the Civil Rights Movement. She said Reverend Abernathy was her uncle. Well, at that time, Reverend Abernathy wasn't that famous. But she was just telling me somebody as a member of her family. And I saw her for the first time in 50 years, about 3 years ago, when the Abernathy family came to Selma, Alabama. But anyway, when we get there to the bus station, she gets bored and leaves because there's a police line up. We can't cross the police line. I can't use the ticket that I purchased. So what happened is she left, and I hung around, middle around, and I met this young man by the name of Wilson Brown. And Wilson Brown had been sent there by Reverend Shuttlesworth to work with the Freedom Riders in Birmingham. And I told Wilson, I got my own ticket and I'm ready to go. And after I explained to him I had a ticket and I had bought this knife. It was a switchblade or something. I had never had a knife before, but I bought it because I said, well, I'm gonna get on this bus. With all this stuff going on. And anyway, he said, well, you can't go because you don't understand the concept of nonviolence. Well, I had heard the word and looked it up in the dictionary. I have a dictionary with me now. I looked it up in the dictionary, the word was not there. It's in the dictionary now. It wasn't then. And he said, well, you can't go. I said, well, explain the word. Explain it to me. He said, well, that's when somebody hits you. You can't hit them back. I said, I don't think I want to do that. So I got a refund from my ticket. A few days later, I got a refund for my ticket. And Wilson was coming into the coffee lounge, the A.G. Gaston coffee lounge where I hung out with my friends. And he walked over to me one night. He said, well, how would you like to go to Atlanta to a student nonviolent coordinating committee meeting? And I thought about this thing. I said, well, I haven't ever been to Atlanta before. And I'm going to get the opportunity to go free. And then I'm going to learn more about civil rights movements. I left my knife at home and I went to Atlanta, and everything is history after that. I met the first decent white people that I knew. I met Ann and Carl Brady from Louisville, Kentucky. Her husband wrote the book, The Wall Between, and they had been arrested and penalized for selling a house to some black people. Then I met Dottie Selma. She was a Dottie Miller then. She was one of the one of the first freedom riders. I met Julian Bond. I met James Foreman. I met Ella Baker. And the thing about this Ella Baker, I looked at her and I said, what's this old lady doing with us? But I didn't know that Ella Baker had already contributed 25 years of her life to the civil rights movement. She had a lot of contacts and stuff. If it hadn't been for Ella Baker, we might not have ever had a Martin Luther King. she was the one that suggested that Martin Luther King become head of the Montgomery Civil Rights movement. She was the one who organized SCLC. She also was their first executive director, but well, a lot of male chauvinist going on there. There's still something going on there with them guys, you know, they not. But anyway, the youth part of SCLC was the ones who organized the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They left because they didn't want to wait 20 years. Diane there said they didn't want to wait 20 years to come from the back of the bus and to eat at lunchtime. They started, the city started, I think, in 61, but the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee started in 60. And the first office they had was upstairs over the Atlanta World in Birmingham, in Atlanta. It had a hole in the floor. Upstairs, we had this big hole, and we had to be careful to walk around and not miss the hole. And that was when I met Jim Foreman, who was very instrumental in me being involved today. And Ella Jo Baker, who got me doing this stuff now. I'm still doing stuff. I don't know what's wrong. I guess I still got some other purposes. But anyway, if y'all would like to ask me some questions, a lot of the stuff I've forgotten, so sometimes people have to remind me to, Annie Pearl, what you doing? I said, oh, they said, well, you know, Annie Pearl, you were doing, I said, oh yeah. But anyway, if you got any questions you need to ask me, there's a lot of stuff I've forgotten, and a lot of stuff I will remember if you ask me.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, now I'm in Selma, Alabama, working with the Slavery and Civil War Museum there, along with the Voting Rights Museum. And I'm also in the museum there. I'm also in the Institute in Birmingham. You got a copy of my portrait they did. Mr. Chester Higgins did. And when he did it, I didn't like it at first. I thought it was old. And he said, I asked him, I said, why did you do it in black and white? He said, Annie Pearl, they didn't have a lot of color in it. And then I began to understand. He said, it makes you look more eloquent. So I began to like it, and as you can see, I like it so much I made sure that everybody got a copy of it.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Welcome back to Pittsburgh. I know you said it's been almost 40 plus years since you've been back here. So
It's been 50 some years, huh? I'm 78. It's been a long time. I think 62 was the last time I was here. 60, yeah, 62, around 62.
And so you were talking about a little bit about your discovery into voting rights. You were actually, the project director for SNCC in charge of registering people to vote. Can you talk about a little bit about like how you got involved into that work and why you decided to register people to vote?
Well, I was already involved in SNCC. And there's one thing about Ella Baker, she knew what we needed to do. She also knew what we probably were going to do. But at the time, at first, we were interested in sit-ins and stuff like this. But she wanted it to be our idea. So once we got the right to sit in and come from the back of the bus, then what did we do? But see, Ella Baker already had contacts in places where, in Mississippi and Georgia and places where we needed to work on voter registration. It was hard sometimes because we went to people's doors. Some of them wouldn't come to the door because they were afraid. And it was real hot too, a lot of times it was hot or cold. We didn't have places to stay. And this is in certain areas where if you talk about voting, you got killed. Mr. Herbert Lee got killed because he was talking about voting. And they told him if you talk about it again, they were gonna kill him. And within 24 hours, he was dead. He was out of Mississippi. And the Albany, Georgia movement, I was a part of that. But I understood, once we started doing this, I understood the importance of trying to get people to register to vote. But what happened is, even after we got the Voting Rights Act, I was on the Selma to Montgomery March that day, and I was the only person arrested in Selma. That was the shortest time I ever spent in jail. But anyway, what they had to do was, just think about this. After we got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Bill, they had to literally have the federal government to come in and run these places in the South so people could feel comfortable in coming in to get registered without getting beaten or killed, because even though the law is there, it's only as good as the enforcement. And just a few years ago here, they just stopped. They had, where the registrar was, it was Justice Department people running those places, literally registering the people to vote. Until we finally got enough people to elect our first African-American president. And Reverend Joseph Byron, who was with the SCLC and who was one of my friends, he said we dropped the ball. What we did is we stopped doing anything after we got this stuff. And now we're in trouble. And another thing about voting is, people, if you don't understand what happens with your vote or what happens with the government, everything that you do is determined by the government. Whether you can walk across the street, the enforcement of it, spitting on the sidewalk, is still against the law. Jaywalking is still against the law. But you can do it. It's only as powerful as the enforcement. And then people have gotten complacent. They think that these things just happen. We have gotten satisfied. And another thing people don't understand is that once we got the Voting Rights Act and the Voting Rights Bill, the people who were Dixiecrats went to the Republican Party. They all left the Democratic Party. They were part of the Democratic Party at first, until we got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Bill under Lyndon Johnson. Then they moved to the Republican Party. And it has evolved into what it is today. It's no longer the same party. No, it's no longer the same party. It's a different party altogether, because all of these people who were Dixiecrats have gone to become a part of the Republican Party and influencing this. And a lot of people don't understand that everything, the government controls most things, but the people who have the most of the money control everything. Like, that's something you have to understand. And if you don't understand it, you don't understand that you need to call your city councilman and stuff. City council supposed to be able to answer the phone when you call. They're not supposed to have a machine on answering the phone. Any elected official, you're supposed to be able to contact your elected official. We didn't know about that. But of course, some of us don't want to know. But it's very important If you want to get, and then you have to have unity. Now, this, another thing that I'd like to say is about these people who, these demonstrations lately who've been doing violence. Now, we have to understand when we've been infiltrated. That's a part of an infiltration. And if you can't control your demonstration, don't have it. We didn't have any violent demonstrations. Now somebody will bring a whole pallet of bricks, and then no black person do that. That's somebody infiltrated our organization. See, that's because you don't have control. And I'm opposed to any violent organization. We outgunned and we're outmanned. Y'all know with that. And Jim Lawson explained it better than anybody. As a matter of fact, if it hadn't been for Jim Lawson, it might not have been a Martin Luther King. Because he was the one that taught Martin Luther King about nonviolence. Okay? And even I didn't like the idea of being, nonviolent. I could never go to the nonviolent workshops. But this made a decision I was going to participate. So I tried to abide by the rules. But you're at a loss if you're going to do it. If you let somebody come in and do some stuff, you're at a loss too.
Thank you for that. And I know you were talking about like your journey from nonviolence to self-defense, but I want to go back because Professor Block did a little bit of an overview of how it's changed. Can you talk about some of the things you have seen from the first time you voted until now?
Well, I was working on voter registration until I was, because I was moving around until I was about 20. My first time voting was in Atlanta. I had moved to Atlanta. When the things died down in the civil rights movement, I moved to New York. I stayed there for a couple of years, and then I moved to Atlanta, where I made my home for 25 years. And I was able to vote real easy there. And there are still places where people weren't able to vote, even in the 70s. As a matter of fact, Burnsville, Georgia, where Omari was killed, I was in the tax division and went there in 75 with a fair. Mr. Plain in Atlanta. I was in tax bill. And I took this friend of mine along with me. And once we got the man there and left him, I told him, I said, I'm hungry. So we stopped in this restaurant. I said, there's one right there. We went in and they had like a window or something where a black lady was back there. And she kept telling me to go to the back of the building. It's 1975, But my friend come on real quick. He said, baby, let's go. Let's get out of here. And after he explained it to me, I thought about it. Now, see, I should have noticed that, but I didn't. But what happened is they taken the signs down, but the people of the local knew not to do it. The same thing is happening in places like Selma, Alabama, and all these places. Now, a lot of people do not step out and participate because they're afraid they're going to get fired or somebody's been. The threat is still there. And we could have been killed there. If we had, I'm saying, I just didn't know the day. And me being a civil rights person who experienced and are able to detect certain things, I should have been able to detect that, but I didn't. 1975, Burnsville, Georgia, where Aubrey was killed. All of the black folk knew not to mix, not to go into certain areas, restaurants or whatever. And I guess certain things about Alabama, what happened is the redistricting too is a problem. there are a lot of things, a problem we need to address, and we can't address them all tonight or this evening. But we need to get to work on it. We need to tighten up. And the other thing is they don't want us to know about, don't want people to know about Black history. Well, white people need to know about it too. So they'll be well informed. They need to know that millions of years ago, we was the one that created first civilization. And I talked to Professor Tony Browder, and that's what has me working in the African American enslavement and Civil War Museum, because I'm learning a lot more. I'm broadening my whole concept about a whole lot of things. He said, start off with the positive. When I heard him say that, I wanted to know what the positive was. He said, let's start talking about we were slaves when we came here. We were not slaves when we came here. Some of us were kings, and we, millions of years ago, where we created the first civilization in the world. And I'm also learning from some white professors and Black professors that come through there. I don't know everything. But I'm going to college right there in the museum. Because I didn't know out of all these years that the word Egypt is Greek. It's not African. I always assumed it was African. And if you don't like yourself, we got to like ourselves. If you don't like yourself, nobody else is going to like you. Now that has something to do with voting too. All of this has a lot to do with how you feel about yourself, how important you feel things are. If you don't like yourself, you do drugs. All of this is a sign of low self-esteem. Not voting. I got to do something else to be seen.
Thank you for all of that. You talked about.
Did I answer your question?
You did.
Bring it back to.
Listen, we'll do that. But you talked about going back to school. So can you take us back to the Freedom School and the things you learned at the Freedom School and how they organized around letting people know how to vote and how to organize?
Well, one thing about Freedom School, that's where I learned about Harriet Tubman. Because when I was going to school, I was always trying to find some history about Black people. But I didn't know anything about anyone except Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver. Now, what they did too is they belittled George Washington Carver by saying he was a peanut man. George Washington Carver was an agricultural scientist. And there's a difference between a peanut man. This is how they describe it. So these are the things that we have to look out for. I didn't know anything about Harriet. I didn't know anything about Frederick Douglass. And one thing about it is Jim Foreman, who was executive director of SNCC, was always saying to me, Emperor, you need to read W. Du Bois. I don't feel like reading no book. Why am I going to read this stuff? He wants to get me to read, but you know what? Before Foreman died, I was reading everything, and I've been reading everything ever since. I'm reading everything I can get my hands on that relates to the change here in America and what's going on now and before and beyond, all the way back millions of years ago when we created the first civilization in the world. I'm saying a lot of people don't know that we created the air conditioner, okay? Matter of fact, the cell phone, which you use every day now, and it's important, you gotta like it's part of it. A black man created the cell phone. He patented it. It's in the library. The information I'm talking is in the library, but it's not gonna come out and jump out at you. It's gonna be something you have to go see. Now, my friends who are whites, who support us, is good, you see, because there are some white people who support us. And I suggested, also that we go to slavery by, Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington. Because in that, it also talks about our religion. Our religion was Islam. The only reason we were using Christianity is because in order to get your freedman's papers, you had to say that you were a Christian. And the church was where we were plotting to get away. And they stopped that after Reimagine. We couldn't gather except in the church. It was more than 2 people. But then after Reimagine, we couldn't gather in the churches either. You see? So we need to know the history instead of assuming things happen. Or either you listen to somebody else say and they repeat it, and by the time 3 or 4 people repeat something, you go, oh my goodness, there's no telling what you get. But this is I'm not trying to push this, but this is where I got it. And it also talks about some of the white people, once we were freed from slavery, some of the slaves went back to the plantation where they were because they were treated better there. They went to other places and then they came back. And once we were free, we were supposed to, some of the people even gave them to the whites who had slaves. They gave them supplies to go with it, and those people came back to them. I also found out that what happened is we survived. We were not supposed to survive this, but we were able to survive because we were able to grow our own food. We didn't eat much meat. Meat is not really good. I love meat, but really meat is not good for you. But I ate, that's one way of surviving. Your health is at the top of the list. Because without your health, nothing else means anything. And we were not supposed to survive this.
Okay.
But we have to understand what is important, what's not important. There was a man that came in the voting rights museum in Selma, white guy. He comes in with his granddaughter, and what he come in to do is undermine this thing, teach you about segregation. So they go to the museum and they get to the gift shop, and the little girl see this book. She's only about 8 years old, maybe 9. She see this book, and in bold letters it says for children, but in small letters it says Rosa Parks. So when they got ready to leave, we asked them, at least I did, I asked them how did they feel and were they satisfied? And the little girl said, I wanted that book. Which book did you want? And I found out what book she wanted. And this guy wouldn't buy the book for her. And you know what? I gave her the book. Now, whether she kept this book when she left, I don't know, but she threw a temper tantrum to get that book. Then she wanted to take some pictures in. We could take pictures. But this man that brought her in there, he brought her in there for another purpose to see how it worked out. I don't know whether she still has that book or not, but
You're talking about, surviving. This picture we have behind us is, the 57th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. You were there, experienced a lot of this violence to get voting rights. Can you talk about what it was like protesting and organizing, going through the Mississippi Freedom Project, surviving Bloody Sunday? What was that like for you?
well, see, I had already been in Albany, Georgia in jail. I just got out of jail in Natchez, Mississippi. And I came back to Alabama when we had problems in Alabama. I came back home and I was project director in Hale County, Alabama. And a lot of people don't understand what happened with that march. The march did not start for voting rights. The march started because of Jiminy Jackson was murdered in Marion, Alabama, for asking the police not to beat his grandfather because he was an old man. The state trooper gunned the boy down. He died later. Now, the original march from Selma to Montgomery, we were supposed to take his dead body in a casket to Montgomery. But we don't even talk about they don't even talk about Jiminy Jackson. But the original march had nothing to do, the initiation had nothing to do with voting rights. I'm not saying that it's just good that it evolved into something positive, but these are the facts. And they talk about changing the name of the bridge. They want to change the Martin Luther King, they want to change John. It needs to be Jiminy Jackson, if anybody. Not John Lewis. John Lewis, my friend, but I'm just saying it needs to be there. But I've been working on voter registration for a little while. I was in Clarksville, Mississippi, during the Mississippi summer. I was in Albany and several other places, but I ain't been working on voter registration for a long time. So what started me was diligently working on voter registration was after we got the civil, after we were able to go in the hotels and the lunch counters and stuff like this. And Miss Baker was the one that influenced me, and she's influencing me right now. Because I go places, I don't go to get paid, I like money if somebody give me some, because I don't have it. But I have a purpose. I'm not sure what all the purposes are or whether that's my purpose, but I'm a product and a tool of Ella Joe Baker.
And so for the majority of your life, you have been fighting for voting rights, fighting to make sure that people have their basic needs met. As Professor Block was talking about, we're going back a little bit. So how are you processing still having to keep fighting for voting rights, doing the same things you were doing in the 70s, the 60s, and the 80s?
Well, I fight for injustice wherever I see it. And I guess it's become a part of me. A friend of mine told me, he said, because when I was in the tax business, I saw injustice in the tax business and would stop driving my cab. Once you start organizing, you're going to start sacrificing. Okay? And a friend of mine told me, said, Annie Pearl, you're going to always be broke because you're always getting involved in these things. I helped with Maynard Jackson with his campaign and stuff. Maynard used to come in the slick office when he was a boy. A lot of people don't know that he was a boy, but I had protests against him. He's my friend, tax cab was getting, that tax cab driver was getting injustice. And I told him we wanted to have a parade. He said, well, y'all can't go down Peachtree. I said, but all parades go down Peachtree. And the next day when we got ready to have it, they had a police escort. But anyway, I continue to do things right now. I was at the Poor People's March a couple of weeks ago with Reverend Barbara. I work with whoever is working on some of the things. I might not agree with everything, but I agree with some of the things that Reverend Barbara is, and I work with him on. And whoever, if there's I'm broke though. But I'm happy.
Okay, and my last question before we turn it over back to Professor Block is, you're back in Pittsburgh. You talked about, originally coming to Pittsburgh, being able to go to the movies, being able, to do the things that you want to do. How have you been able to be a part and recognize that you're part of living history, but still enjoy your life?
Well, I don't really want, I guess it's a matter of wanting, but I don't want a whole lot. I just need to be able to now, especially in this time, I was self-employed when I was in the tax business in Atlanta, and that was good. I made money. When I first got to Atlanta, I had this job, and I didn't have transportation, and I wasn't making any money. And people were saying, well, why do you want to go into tax? But see, I solved both of my problems. When I got into tax, I solved my transportation problem and my money problem. But in Selma, there, Miss Rose Sanders, who's Senator Hale Sanders' wife, said to me, Annie Pearl, that car is 20 years old. I said, I don't care. I know how to buy a car. You a lawyer, but I know how to buy a car. So I was happy with that, but it depends on what you want in life. Right now, I like to see changes. I know I probably won't ever see it complete in my lifetime. But things have gotten really bad because what happened is when the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Bill came out, what happened is Lyndon Johnson some kind of way almost destroyed the Klan. Matter of fact, Ulysses S. Grant did too. And Ulysses S. Grant, in my opinion, should get more credit than Lincoln. Lincoln said he wanted to bring the country back together. And also, that's how we got these states' rights. And that was one of the agreements that, they would have states' rights. You see, there's so many things that we don't know. With the 40 acres and a mule, some people got it. And guess who was the one who originally suggested? Compton Sherman Williams. And Ruff B. Hayes came in and stopped it. Ruff B. Hayes became president, he stopped it quickly. And that's how things are happening today. Things are stopped because they gutted for the voting, they gutted the voting Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And they've been redistricting all the time until now. They've almost got a perfect system in terms of redistricting to keep you from getting it, especially in the Black communities and poor communities, keep you from getting in power. And we need to go to work. We need to get real busy.
Thank you so much.
We need to clean up our communities from drugs. The last place this stuff stops is in the Black community. No one else would tolerate this stuff. And another thing is, this is my opinion, that when Malcolm and Dr. King started talking about coming together, that's what got both of them killed. Martin and his, I knew Dr. King, we weren't bosom buddies, but I knew Dr. King. But one of the things he did, he was fulfilling his purpose in the last days. If you notice, he only went to places like Alabama or something like that, when he first, but what happened is, when he started organizing garbage workers and the poor people's camp, that was something. And all they had to do, because before that, they were guarding him. They were checking him when he got on the plane, they were checking to see that nobody had a bomb on the plane. But all they had to do was just let down the guard. Somebody was looking to kill him. And when he got killed in Memphis, it was just because that particular person had the opportunity and did it. And they allowed it to happen. And I was in New York when he got killed. Was working in a restaurant. And it's a funny thing about being disciplined. I was well disciplined. That night, when Martin got killed, I lived in Harlem on 129th Street. When I got up there, things was, people were breaking in and doing, but you know what? I wanted to do something, but I couldn't get involved in that. You know what? It was not organized and it was not a purpose. It was just sporadic, And I just stood outside and watched these people do what they did. But I didn't get involved physically in that because I was well disciplined. It wasn't organized, it was just, sporadic, at random, whatever. So I don't get involved in anything that's not organized. It's not well organized.
Thank you so much. And just a reminder that we'll have a question and answer session after Professor Block finishes his second presentation. So I'll hand it over to you.
So I realize that I keep going back to big picture things. And so the how we got here portion of this was pretty well displayed in the things that I drew up. The where we're going thing is where I want to talk a little more about it. And I keep going back and forth with this because I'm a university professor, that's my job, right? I spend a lot of time talking to people who don't study the United States. In other words, I spend time studying with people who study the Ukraine-Russian conflict, people who spend a significant amount of time overseas and have seen different types of governments than the ones that we have the privilege of living in the United States. And there are lots of lessons to learn from it. And this is an intellectual thing, but I want y'all to think about the last time y'all might have heard what they call American exceptionalism. As a kid, I always thought it was a compliment, right? Like it meant that being in the United States is made you special in some kind of way. Maybe you're more confident than other people are. Maybe you have something in you that makes you a little different than your neighbors in other countries, whatever the case, right? A lot of my colleagues, when they think about what American exceptionalism is, they think about the fact that the exceptional thing is that the United States, as it's currently set up, wasn't always the United States. Like we have a whole history of colonists coming to the eastern side of the country and then expanding westward and all of the stuff that comes with it. That wasn't a democracy. That was a bunch of colonies that had their own governments, and some of them even had their own currency. And the whole experiment was getting a bunch of states to figure out how to work together on behalf of something bigger than what they were. And all of this stuff about the Constitution, all of this stuff about these current issues that relate back to the eroding of democracy, a lot of that gets me thinking about this whole notion of American exceptionalism. So it means that we might be special, right? But one of the ways that we might be special as people in the United States is that we had a non-democracy that became a democracy and it didn't break up. right? Because if you look across the globe, that doesn't happen a lot. Like a lot of places that aren't democracies, if they become democracies, it's fragile and it doesn't last very long and something else gets put in its place. So we have what they call this American experiment. It's been going on for centuries, right? I think a lot of us just think that it's just guaranteed to work. And that's not true. And I feel like there's a certain amount of arrogance that goes into being a United States citizen because you just think it's going to work. We just heard from someone who knows what it's like to live in an authoritarian regime. And that just so happened to be the Jim Crow South, right? Now, most people don't think of the Jim Crow South as an authoritarian regime, but think about it. Suppression of voting rights, codes of conduct that keep groups of people from being able to express themselves the way they truly want, education programs that suppress history, and all of these things, right? We actually have examples of that in the United States right now that we can go to. And we have historical examples of that in the United States that we can look back to. And so I would love to talk to you about the February 6th hearings. I would love to talk to you about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? All of this fits with this pattern. And that to me suggests that the democracy that we describe here, the republic that we describe, that we usually describe as a democracy, it's not permanent. We could lose it. We could lose it, and we're seeing signs of what it's like to have a fragile democracy. And we're seeing signs from what my colleagues tell me in international politics about what it might look like if an authoritarian regime that's something different than what we usually think about in the United States were actually to occur. And this tells me is that if we're thinking big picture, that means that if democracy is fragile, we have to work to keep it. It's not natural for it to persist. And one way to continue to have democracy in the United States is to fix the isms and the phobias, right? I'm talking about homophobia, transphobia, I'm talking about xenophobia, I'm talking about racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, all of that stuff. Because those things are connected in the sense that when we have those things prevail, it's that democracy. Doing something about those things is actually good for democracy. And I know that you probably didn't come here for this speech, right? But I feel like it's a lot of this, like the particulars that we could discuss because current events are really important. Those things always get me to thinking back big picture. And if you think about the, I guess, things that strengthen what we call the American experiment here, they're usually the things that make us more inclusive, that bring more people into civic involvement, make the system work more for people. When we move in a direction where the system doesn't work equally for people, that's usually the sign that our democracy is in trouble. And what that means is it's very easy to think about this in terms of who's being directly affected. You might say, for example, where that doesn't matter to me because it's that group, but that's a very short-sighted way of thinking about it. Because everyone in this room most likely likes the idea of living in a democracy. We can fight tooth and nail about how you implement stuff. That's the reason why the Democrats don't get along with the Republicans, right? But Democrat, Republican, whatever, everyone agrees that there are certain things that we value in this country. We usually call that stuff the American creed. Now, the creed isn't controversial. The particulars are. I just want to bring it back to the creed and think about it this way. And I honestly think that it's better for the country to be inclusive. Not because I'm a bleeding heart liberal, but because I like democracy. And I think that when we don't have inclusivity and diversity and equity and fairness and justice and all of those things, it erodes it. And I'm not really in the position to think about what that would look like if we don't have it. But I know that we have examples in our country about what it looked like when we did it. I'm thinking about the Jim Crow South. I'm thinking about some of the things that are happening currently that have people very worried and very concerned. It's not necessarily me here sounding an alarm, but me thinking about this stuff big picture. And I want to make sure that big picture part of this is what's being looked at right now. And so the political polarization, the attack on the legitimacy of the government, the differences of opinion that can sometimes lead to violent clashes among neighbors. All of that stuff to me spells the danger about what it is that we're not maintaining, and what we're not maintaining is a healthy democracy. And I think having a healthy democracy is bigger than any single person.
Professor, I'd like to ask you a question, and kind of get your expertise on this. I understand that when the Constitution was written, it was not written for us, it was written for some elite. And finally, they had to begin to enforce it equally among everybody, or try to enforce the democracy part. That was that's what I wanted to ask you. Of course, what would be your response to that?
It's even more cynical than that, right? So there's one school of thought that says that that Black people didn't really have a place in the Constitution. I would argue they did, and that place was to be subservient to white people. In other words, the decision, so like there's the thing that we have, right? But then there's the decision making that went into what we got. And the Constitution is a weird document. You know what I mean? And like it's probably going to offend some people, but I don't see it as this thing that should be held above criticism. I feel like there's a lot of really interesting political things that happened before we got it. One of the things that had to happen is that northern states and southern states had to come up with a compromise, right? There are tons of compromises in our Constitution because the people that were making it needed to agree on stuff. There's the 3/5 compromise, which most people think about in terms of population, and that's for political representation, right? So you basically create this arbitrary number and make Black people a fraction of a person so that you can count up a representation. Why?
We were not even a human being.
Yeah, it's even worse than that.
Well, I know that, but I'm just going back.
Yeah, but the compromise, but this is the one most people know, right? It's the whole idea is you can count Black people a little so that southern states can get more representation in Congress, right? But then there's another reason for it. If you count Black people a little, that means that the North can tax Southerners and they can benefit from having a bigger population. Now, the Southerners didn't like that part, right? They wanted to count Black people for representation purposes, but they didn't want to build their numbers up for tax purposes, right? So they fought over that, and that was the compromise. So the 3/5 compromise is some arbitrary number that politicians came up with. What that means is they're already thinking about what to do to Black people, right? There are other compromises in our Constitution that have to do with commerce. And what does it do about the transfer of money? And one of the compromises is that the Constitution wouldn't talk about slavery.
Well, another thing I wanted to ask you a question about was your opinion about the word socialism. Now, my opinion is that socialism is our social security, but I'm not a PhD in nothing. I'm just, ask questions, everything.
So this is good. I might have lost my mic. I could just
take this. Then we'll switching back and forth.
It always fascinates me. Before I got into political science, I was a philosophy major, and we would read Karl Marx. And when we would read Karl Marx, we would always kind of like the thing we thought was fascinating about Marx. I know we're talking about socialism, but a lot of people, they start here, right? We always thought what made Marx interesting wasn't the political ideology stuff, but the idea that people follow what I want to call a social life cycle, right? So what Marx did that we thought was fascinating is he put people in this cycle of oppression, where if you oppress a group of people for so long, they have a revolution and they replace the system with something else, right? Socialism was always the go-between like the oppressive capitalist system and this utopia they call communism, right? As a philosophy major, I just thought that was fascinating because that means you can study people, right? Like people can be studied the same way you study plants, or you study meteors, or you study the stars, right? Like you can actually study human beings, and you can be a human being and actually study human behavior. Now that's what I take from Marx, right? I believe that the thing that most people like about Marxian ideas is that they work from a system of understanding oppression. Now, the way we're normally thought to think about democracy, we're normally thought to think about it as being hand in hand with capitalism, right? And that's because we made choices in the United States about how the government is going to work. Normally, it's bad competition in terms of ideas for any other type of system of government to be thought about. And it's odd because capitalism isn't a system of government, it's an economic structure, right? That give resources equally to people just doesn't fit with capitalism. But it fits very well with oppressing, like with groups that understand what oppression is, because they're thinking about not being taken advantage of and actually thinking about what it means to operate in a more fair kind of way. So there's a lot of space for conversations about racial inclusion and Marxian theories and socialistic ideas, right? But even then, there's a fair amount of racism even in Marxian thinking. You know, that's the reason why we have certain thinkers that talk about this a whole lot too.
Perfect. Hold on one second, if you could give him the mic back one more time. Because one of our questions said, Professor, education, or what other reading materials do you recommend on this subject?
I would say nothing I'm ever going to write is going to be any better than anything W.E.B. Du Bois. Right?
W. Du Bois?
Yep. I would say read Ida B. Wells. I would say read W.E.B. Like read the classics because none of this stuff is new, right? Like the idea that democracy will continue to be bad if we don't fix racism is something that was talked about back in the 1700s, right? There's a French theorist by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville who wrote a book called Democracy in America. And he, as a foreigner, came to the United States back when it was in the colonial times and wrote about how important it is to understand racism, to understand what democracy in America looks like. Ralph Bunch, who was an international politics scholar, also the previous, at one point in time, the chair of the political science department at Howard University, which is where I got my degree, right, was commissioned to help out with a report that was written by a Swedish social thinker by the name of Gunnar Myrdal. And Myrdal had a book called Democracy in America back in 1944. And it's saying the same stuff that I'm talking about now. The idea is that America will either make it or not make it, depending on how racist it is. If it continues to stay racist and sexist and transphobic and xenophobic, the democracy will fail. If it gets over this stuff, then the democracy has a chance to succeed. So if you look at stuff to read, I would say start with the classics, because they still prevail today.
Well, another thing I wanted to say was when I started demonstrating and stuff, they started saying I was a communist. So I had to go to the dictionary again because I looked up the word communist. I said, I'm not that. What are they talking? I'm overthrow the government? Me? I'm just saying it really, tripped me out. Communist as a communist. I'm not a communist. I read the definition for it. But I carry a dictionary with me everywhere I go now. I was reading this book and it kept saying they kept talking about it was something that was described as a dictionary, but it was a word. And I couldn't figure out, so I got halfway through this book and I don't understand what it means. So I'm working at the nursing home where I retired from. I went to my friend who was our occupational health nurse that I was friends with. I went and said, hey, I got to see the dictionary you got. I didn't have it across the street, it was in my car. And I read what it was. It's another dictionary. You see, the word meant dictionary. I had to go to, it's an old dictionary. This is the dictionary that had all the words. They changed the meaning of a lot of words. They changed the meaning of the word Negro. they changed the meaning with several meanings of words. And also, what I understand about, not to change subject, but I understand about Columbus, is when he got here, he made the statement, he wrote it in his memoirs, he said, the Indians were peaceful, and they were friendly, and easily to be conquered. Now, why would you think about something like that? Which means is they don't have any guns. They're friendly, and I can take over.
And what's your, I'd like your opinion. I'm saying, I'm asking for your opinion because you, Professor, I'm just, everyday lady.
You are anything but an everyday person. I'm learning so much by being on this panel with you right now.
Well, I have a question for you. So it's come from an audience member. You talked about the news saying you're a communist. You're going out, you're getting arrested. It's often referred to as good trouble. How did you justify, going out and deciding to break the law? But some people have been raised, you vote, you pay attention, you follow the politicians, you follow your military leaders, and breaking the law may not be something that they would ever consider or ever do. So how did you come to that conclusion that
Well,
you
there was
were?
There was nothing going on at the time except the visibility that I could see. I'm young, so I want some action. So the sit-ins and the freedom rides was action for me. Of course, it grew to something else, it grew to reality and other things, the person that I am today. I find out if things are happening and you don't say nothing, and you don't do nothing, it will continue to happen. Sometimes I've even had to go it alone. But even when I went alone, they thought it was an army behind me because I had the experience of a Eleanor Baker and a Jim Foreman. When I met John Lewis, I think it was in 61 at my first SNCC meeting. And at one time in Atlanta, people who were in SNCC had an apartment. And they thought they had the apartment, but actually the apartment belonged to SNCC because folk would come in with their sleeping bag. I said, but bring your sleeping bag on in. And one time I remember John Lewis had holes in the bottom of his shoes. And he held them up like this, and I had mine, and I held mine up, two mines had holes in the bottom of them. And I think that was in 63. When I was there demonstrating. But whatever trouble was, the matter of fact, they used to tell me, see, you like it hot. Because I went to Selma in 62, and I went to Selma in 1962, and I didn't say I left. It was dead. And I also had a joke about me traveling too. Everybody else was coming in asking for a plane ticket, and I was coming in asking for a bus ticket or either. Is anybody going to Mississippi? Put my name on the board, tell them to call me.
Yes, you said you went to Selma. So why was that the arrest? Can you talk about your arrest in Selma?
What was it again?
Can you talk about your arrest in Selma?
Well, it wasn't much to it except what happened is I had come out of Mississippi, and my friend Virginia Wells and her husband, Dr. Aaron Wells, had created this thing called the Medical Committee. And they came into Mississippi to help us because we were afraid to go to the doctors. We were afraid they were going to kill us or not wait on us or whatever. And when I got to back in Alabama, and a few days before the march, I called Jenny and I said, told her, just telling her what we were doing. She said, well, do you need us? I said, yeah, come on. So she came on with a group. And actually, I wasn't supposed to go on the first march. I was supposed to bring another march in case that would fail. The second wave. And Jenny said, well, how do I get to the bridge? I said, well, I don't know much about Selma, but I can take you to where the bridge, we were at Brown Chapel Church. Actually, Brown Chapel Church was used because it was the closest church to the bridge that was participating with us. And I get in the van, and when I get to where the back of the march, I jump out of the van, and I become a part of the march. And then all of a sudden, I heard something sound like gunshots. But it wasn't gunshots, it was tear gas. And I'm trying to move forward, and they had these what you call it, posse men or whatever they had, I just spoke to police. He grabbed me, he said, you can't go any further. I said, I can go where I want to go. So all of a sudden, he shoved me, and we were having a physical disagreement. I got a book out there with that story in it. It was a physical disagreement. I was arrested, and somebody saw me get arrested. Brother by the name of Sunshine, we called him Sunshine because he was real black. But that was his nickname, Sunshine. He lost his leg on the poor people's march, and someone ran over his leg and he finally died. But Sunshine, he was from Birmingham. And he saw me get arrested. And when everything had died down, they were looking for me. They said, where is Annie Pearl? John Lewis said, where is Annie Pearl? And Sunshine said, well, she in jail. And Peter Hall, attorney Peter Hall, was our legal defense. He came in from Birmingham. And he didn't want to come back. I just found out about 10 years ago that Peter was the one personally bonded me out. I didn't know it. I know somebody, I thought maybe the committee, whatever. But anyway, Peter bonded me out. And they didn't let me out of jail until about 11, 12 o'clock at night. Peter was back in Birmingham by then. But I was fortunate. Actually, that was the shortest time I ever stayed in jail. I was there for just a few hours. But inside the jail, I could hear people moaning and grunting, because the jail is right close to where the bridge is. And I could hear all this noise and stuff. And I was the only one in the jail. I was making noise, much noise as I could. And that's, the real noise was going on outside where people were being beaten and molested. And Jiminy Jackson died after they had him in the hospital. Reverend Shuttlesworth didn't want to go he was beaten within an inch of his life. And he didn't want to go to the hospital because he was afraid they were going to kill him. And these are the kind of things and there were people who are unseen and unheard of and not talked about, like Jenny Wells and her husband, Aaron, who developed this thing called the medical committee. You see, when Cheney, Swain, and Goodman were murdered, we knew before we left Oxford, Ohio, people had been in the civil rights, we knew that Cheney, Swain, and Goodman were dead. Now, another thing about this, see, they weren't looking for Cheney, they were looking for Swain and Goodman because the white folks getting killed. If it had not been for some white people participating in the marches and in the civil rights movement, we just would have been some dead black people. Because see, they found 9 other bodies when they were looking for Cheney, Swain, and Goodman, black people. But they didn't tell nobody about that until 20 years later when they opened it up. George Floyd being killed. One of the things that highlighted this though is that somebody took a picture of this man with his knee on this guy for nine minutes and so many seconds. You know, the cliche about pictures worth 1,000 words, and that went all over the world. You know, but these things are happening all the time. You see, the things like my mother had a skill, you see. But she had 4 of us, and my father and her had broken up. She couldn't leave her children, so she went on public assistance. And once you get on public assistance, it's hard to get off. Because it ain't nothing but a trap. It's not set up for you to get off of it. If you went and got a job 2 weeks later, they would cut your check off. You ain't got time to recoup, you know, where you can handle it. Okay? And I didn't think about that until, you know, my mother she was a nurse. But she couldn't use her skill. Okay? Another thing is, when they start talking about healthcare, I didn't think about this either. My mother delivered a baby across the street from us. The lady didn't have the money to get the bus to go to her clinics. She didn't have the money. It was $25 at that time to pay so you could go to the hospital. Now, I was the one that they sent to the phone. Everybody in the Black community didn't have a phone, and probably in the poor white community either. But there were 2 people that had phones, and I was the one they sent to the phone. And this is what I was told. It's UAB now, University of Alabama Hospital now, but it was Hillman then. And this is what I was told, and I quote, and I didn't think about that until about 6 years ago when they started talking about how killing healthcare and doing away with healthcare. I was told, do not bring her here. We will not touch her. But when the baby is born, if you bring the baby, we'll look at the baby. Well, I had to go back to the phone again after the baby was born because my mother had forgotten how long that umbilical cord had to be cut, and that's very important. And they told me. And what I think about now is, what if something had happened with the mother or the baby or both? Fortunately, nothing happened. You know, I don't even know the baby's name, the lady's name. We've forgotten about all of that. But one of my neighbors at the time, she's still alive. Cersei remembers. My mother was like, I guess, my mother was the only person I knew that she'll have for nothing with you. But she delivered a baby. And that's something. That means this lady did not have health care. Yeah. We're supporting other countries. We are giving them health care, money for health, and we don't have total health care in this country. And like Winston Churchill said, I quote, charity starts at home and spread abroad. How do you expect people to do better and do well if they're not healthy? And they like to differentiate your teeth from your eyes and all that stuff. All that's part of the body, you know. But anyway, Professor.
So, come back to you, Amy. You had a life of experience, different careers. Is there something that you describe as your greatest gain or your greatest achievement?
Well, probably I feel like my greatest achievement is knowledge. That's one of them. That's the important. And I'm well disciplined. I know how to handle a situation, even when it's real, real bad. At least I try to handle it. But I'm disciplined because I'm able to do this. This has something to do with this. And it has something to do with knowing and being a mentor of disciplined people. You know, like Ms. Baker, when the children were killed in Birmingham, she was one of the first people to get there. And she and I was at the AG Gaston Lounge, and I'm really having a fit. But Miss Baker was calm, and and finally by sitting there with her and carrying on, I became calm. Okay? But I'm sitting beside somebody who's been a civil rights person for 25 years. I'm just an upstart. I wasn't even 21 years old. Okay? But what she was displaying was control. And I didn't know that. Emotion. She said, there's another way to handle this. That's all she said. And then, make a statement every once in a while, but she didn't tell me to stop. And finally, I did stop. And I understand where she's coming from now. You can't get something done by throwing a brick in the window. You can get locked up. If you meet police out on the highway, you can't win your argument out there. You need to try to win it in the courts. So I became well disciplined with these people. And a YT Walker sent me on he was a SL, he came into Birmingham. He sent me on a decoy demonstration. I didn't know what a decoy was. I didn't realize I was going on this decoy demonstration. Because what happened is they were, when we would leave 16th Street Baptist Church, they would arrest us right away. So what they did is, they took us in a van up to where the old post office used to be in Birmingham. It's now the federal court, building. And we got arrested about 3 minutes after we were there, the police was there. And I don't know I'm going on the decoy demonstration. There's just about 5 or 6 of us. And I was the only female. So later on that night, it's about 30, 40 people come. But what we were doing is we were throwing them off because they knew that if you had one demonstration, you wasn't coming back to do the second. There wasn't gonna be no second. This is what the police and Bull Connor had decided. Bull Connor had a tank. Can you imagine having a tank to deal with nonviolent people? The tank is in the Civil Rights Institute. And the bus that was bombed in Anderson, Alabama is there too. They finally were able to find this stuff and they put it in there. And I had a friend of mine by the name of John Palmer. He was a liquor salesman. I mean, a real liquor, go to the clubs and stuff. And that day when they sick the dogs and the hoes and stuff, they arrested everybody. Now, but John was one of them people who was standing on the side, telling them folks ought to stop doing this. And they arrested Johnny in his suit and tie. When they went to arrest him, Johnny said, "You gonna arrest me?" And Bull Collins said, "Arrest all the niggas." and later on, a few days later, after we all got out of jail, Johnny said, "I'm not going to jail in my suit and tie no more." He said, "I'll give y'all some money, but I ain't going to jail in my suit and tie anymore." And he said that for years. He's trying to die, but he said, matter of fact, when I was in New York, he was doing the same thing in New York. And he used to take me to dinner somewhere once in a while when I saw him. But it's amazing the type of things that you learn, And the concept of the March on Washington came from the young lady from Court. Her name was Mary Hamilton. It was born in a room. at the AG Gas and Motel, when we were just sitting around talking, we just gotten out of jail. And Jeremiah X, who was editor for the Muhammad Speaks, was there. We didn't know he was there. I had forgotten he was there. We were just talking. And Mary, we had just gotten out of jail and we were angry because this, that, and the other has happened. And Mary said, we ought to march on Washington. And that stuck. And when they found out that it really was gonna happen, we had to turn it over to people like Dr. King and stuff like this. But the original idea came from Mary Hamilton. And that was when Malcolm was saying, we were talking about laying down on the freeways. I mean, to put it the airport, the plane, the airports and stuff like that. And stopping everything up. And that's when Malcolm said, this is real revolution. But we did not know that Jeremiah X was in the, we forgot about him. He was just there. It was a bunch of people there. It was about 15 of us in there. Some were sitting on the floor, some were standing up. And we were just venting. And that's where it was born.
Well, thank you so much for that. And we're talking, you mentioned earlier, you said, once you start organizing, you start sacrificing. Can you talk a little bit about the sacrifices that go into being organized?
Well, you sacrifice everything when you start doing this. I had somebody that asked me, said, Annie Pearl, so how do we get the masses? You know what? I said to her, masses, they're not coming unless something is happening to all of them at the same time. I said, how many people you have that come every week, every day, every month? She said 10. I said, that's your masses. The other people will come, they'll come in hundreds, but they're only gonna do that for a little while. The real work starts when you have to go knock on doors. The real work starts when you have to go one-to-one. But I learned this from Ms. Baker. She said, if you only convince one, Annie Pearl, so you're doing well.
So, one, thanks so much, Annie Pearl Avery, for coming down from Alabama by bus, but she still does the bus, to sit with us today. Well, thank Professor Ray Boston coming all the way from Penn State. And of course, the Heinz History Museum. I don't see anywhere, but for this wonderful event. And of course, we're going to turn it over to Professor Sam to come back and close us out. There's the air right there. I want to give her hand to put this together. We're going to close it out, so Sam's going to close it out, and then you can go get the rest of the snacks and talk to Annie. We did say if possible, because she is traveling and wants to make sure she does not get sick. If you talk to her, please make sure you have a mask or stay 6 feet away. Thank you so much.
Such a wonderful program. I know I learned a lot from both Dr. Block as well as Annie Pearl Avery. Very valuable information as a historian. I think he saved me a lot from going to the archives and doing research. Everything he was telling us, all of that background stuff, that behind the door stuff that don't appear in the history books, as you were saying. Really gives us a lot of fruit for our historical knowledge. But I'd like to thank, on behalf of the Heinz History Center and the African American Program, to thank everyone who joined us here this evening, as well as those of you who have joined us virtually. I do want to again mention Denia Chalmers, our Associate Curator for African American History. This is her program. It's not a Sam Black program. That's one of the reasons why we hired Denia. She's coming up in September, a couple of months, on her 1-year anniversary of being at the Institute. I'm not publicly saying that she has really been a blessing for us. So you'll hear a lot more and see a lot more and experience a lot more from her in the coming years. So again, thank you, Miracle Jones, Annie Pearl Avery, and Dr. Ray Block. And that's it. Thank you.